Alright, I really quick wanted to go over pivots in Maya. So by default, if you create any object in Maya, say this cube, it starts with the pivot directly in the center of that object. What that means is that if you rotate this around, it's rotating from the dead center of this object. If I scale this, you can see that, when I rotate it, it's still doing that from the center of the object. You can actually change the position of the pivot, and that is going to affect how your object moves. So this is used a lot in animations, and the pivot is basically just where the center of this handle is, in case that wasn't clear. So, you can see I toggle between all of these, and the pivot is pretty much in the same spot. If you press and hold D, you have access to this pivot, and you can move it around. You'll see that when you hit pressing and holding D, the little gimbal changes. So you can move the pivot up and down on one axis. You can move it on the whole axis, or like just anywhere, by clicking this little middle part. And then you can also rotate the pivot around. So notice if I do that, and then I release D, the position of this handle has changed for my move tool, and it's also at some very strange orientation instead of being straight up and down. So for the move tool, this doesn't really affect a whole lot, but when you start doing rotate and scale, that's when it really starts to become more apparent what this can do. So I'm just rotating this, and you can see that rather than rotating from the center of the square, it's rotating around this central point, which is just sort of randomly in space. Same thing with scale. So, hello. So if I go and scale this, you can see that it's actually stretching away from the pivot. So if the pivot is outside the object, when you scale it, the bottom of the object is going to get a little bit farther away from that. But you can see that it is scaling fairly non-uniformly because of the position of the pivot. So there's a few more modifications that you can do with the pivot. So if you ever want this to go back to the center of your object, go to Modify and Center Pivot. One thing that I find fairly helpful is to be able to snap the pivot to a particular point on this cube. So if I press and hold D again, D as in dog, and then V, V as in vertex, it's going to activate vertex snapping. You can see up here that the snapping icon has become active. If I release V, it undoes that. Hold V, activates it. So I'm just going to grab this pivot, and if you drag your mouse over any of these vertices, it's going to snap it directly to the corner, basically, of this cube. And duplicate my object again, press and hold V, and you can see again it's vert snapping, and move it down. I'm not entirely sure, because I probably rotated my object kind of stupidly. Yes, good, okay, that's better, that's what I was expecting. So I had a weird rotation on my object, which means when I translated it down, it didn't quite line up. But you can see that it pretty much lines up now. This is actually how I orient a lot of my boxes for slicing up 3D models and stuff like that. So if you ever want this to go back to the center of your object, go to Modify and Center Pivot. Pivots, again, have a lot of use in animation, especially for like bouncing ball assignments. In this case, I'm just going to really quick, I want one of the arms on this model to be facing downwards instead of being in perfect T-pose. So what I'm going to do is just grab all of the faces on this arm, and very sloppily, might I add, this is not a nice way to model or do things, but this is supposed to be really quick and dirty. So what I want is for this to hopefully stay as uniform in length as I can. So like if I move this around, this is clearly not how an arm behaves, I would hope. And then if I rotate this, I'm going to set my rotation handle back to world mode. If I rotate this, I'm going to have to like drag it down, and it's going to be like this whole big thing, and anytime I rotate it, it's going to change the length of the arm, and I don't want that. So I'm going to take the pivot of these faces, and you can do this, again, with anything you have selected. So I'm going to hold down D to activate the pivot mode. You can see that the gimbal has toggled, and I'm just going to drag that to somewhere kind of in the shoulder. And you can see that now when I go to rotate this, it behaves in a slightly armier fashion, sort of, kind of. Again, not the prettiest thing. There's still a lot of like really trashy deformations in the shoulder. But I'm just going to do a real quick average vertices on the shoulder area, and that is going to make it look a little bit more like an arm again. And this is really all I wanted. I just kind of wanted to be able to see. I think I might actually grab, oh no, it's going to be really hard to select now. I think I might actually grab these, and again, just move the pivot back up here. So this is not like holding the volume of this arm, but I really just kind of wanted something when I'm modeling my armor where I can see, work on a flat hand. This is going to make things easier to orient with 3D printing, versus I can actually see how the shoulder pads and stuff look without them clipping through the arm on at least one side of the body. So pivots are cool, totally use them, really helpful things.